SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease joins us for more on today's UN session. Sherwin, good evening to you and thank you so much for your time. Let's just start first with the statement released by the UN Security Council.
Bongiwe, good to see you. Hot off the press, literally, just before we started this session. The Council releasing this press statement. I'm going to quickly summarize. It's quite lengthy, so I'll just give you some of the highlights. The members of the Security Council expressed grave concern over the escalating violence in and around El-Fasher in North Darfur. The members of the Council condemned the assault by the Rapid Support Forces, the paramilitary group that has been fighting the Sudan Armed Forces on El-Fasher, and its devastating impact on the civilian population. The members of the Security Council also condemned reported atrocities being perpetrated by the RSF against civilian populations, including summary executions and arbitrary detentions, and expressed grave concern at the heightened risk of large-scale atrocities. The members of the Council called on the parties of the conflict to allow and facilitate a safe and unhindered humanitarian access, which has been a huge concern. The lack of humanitarian access for the United Nations. Members of the Security Council reiterated a priority that the parties resume direct negotiations, and the members of the Council unequivocally reaffirmed their unwavering commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity of Sudan, Bongiwe. In this regard, the Council reaffirmed its rejection to the establishment of a parallel governing authority in areas controlled by the RSF, and of course speaks to that concern articulated there by Martha Poby, the Assistant Secretary General for Africa, in terms of the fragmentation of Sudan, which remains a current and pressing concern.
And Sherwin, this is a Security Council, for example, that passed a resolution in June last year demanding that the RSF end its siege of El-Fasher and calling for a halt when it comes to the fighting. But what we've only witnessed is an escalation upon escalation, and one wonders that the calls they make, the condemnation, does it seem to fall on deaf ears?
Yeah, and again, it speaks to the discussions we've had over multiple, conversations, be that in terms of Ukraine, be that in terms of Gaza, be that in terms of Sudan and other theaters of conflict, where sometimes the Security Council pronounces itself and very often is totally ignored. Let me tell you what that Security Council resolution from June last year said in terms of demanding certain actions from the parties, particularly as it related to the RSF siege of El-Fasher, which is the capital of North Darfur. And of course, remember, Bongiwe, that this is a region familiar with atrocities. The genocide of Darfur in the early 2000s remains a pressing issue when we talk about this region. This is what the resolution said. It demanded an end of the siege by the RSF on El-Fasher. It demanded the protection of civilians by all parties, and that they uphold international human rights law and international humanitarian law. It called on member states to refrain from external interference, including the transfer of arms and military equipment to Darfur. That is essentially what the UN Security Council resolution demanded of the parties. And you'll recall that UN Security Council resolutions, unlike presidential statements, unlike press statements, are binding on all UN member states. And so what is clear here is that the instructions of this UN Security Council are being ignored in Sudan, as we've seen it being ignored in other theaters of conflict. And I tell you now, the UN Security Council is meeting in closed consultations after that opening session behind closed doors. And we look to see what steps might be taken here, given just the brazen dismissal or the ignoring of various efforts, be that here at the United Nations, be that at the African Union, be that at IGAD, be that at regional blocs in that region in terms of arresting this conflict. We certainly haven't seen the requisite pressure on the parties to stop fighting.
And Sherwin, right, it brings us to the next point, because what do the next steps then look like? Because we know that the AU Peace and Security Council, for example, passed a communique yesterday demanding an immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities, directed officials to urgently facilitate the negotiating process, right? This is between the leaders of the rival military factions. But what are the UN officials saying in that particular regard?
Yeah, there needs to be better coordination from the various groups we just mentioned. And so you'll hear from Martha Poby, the Assistant Secretary General for Africa, that the Secretary General's personal envoy, Mr. Lamamra, has invited both parties, Bongiwe, to separately enter into technical talks with the United Nations focused on de-escalation and the protection of civilians. He has apparently received encouraging indications from both parties on their willingness to engage in that process. They also, from the UN side, urged member states to use leverage over the parties to encourage them to take the critical step that could lead to the improvement of the protection of civilians throughout Sudan. They also refer to a quartet mechanism comprising the African Union, IGAD, the League of Arab States, and the United Nations that is preparing an inter-Sudanese dialogue under the auspices of the African Union, which could pave the way for a Sudanese-owned and led political process. They talked about consultations being ongoing with key Sudanese stakeholders to refine the design timeline and criteria for participation. And Personal Envoy Lamamra is also coordinating efforts with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States. And of course, you'll know that the UAE has been accused by the Sudanese government, the faction that is aligned with the Sudanese armed forces, of fueling the war in Sudan, the civil war in Sudan, through its support, well-documented support, including from intelligence agencies in the United States, to the transfer of weapons to the RSF by the United Arab Emirates. And so a huge concern here is the external impact on this war and the need to stop the flows of weapons and money that is essentially fueling this conflict.
Yeah, a worrying situation there, Sherwin. Thank you so much for that update. SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease joining us live now for more on that UN session.